welcome to lesson number 10 of Endgames you must know from beginner to master level. And next 4 lesson will be all of them will be about rook endgames. And we first start lesson number 10 and 11 will be rook plus pawn versus rook, and then lesson number 13 and 14 will be rook and 2 pawns versus rook. There are cases the attacking side is winning. There are also cases where the defending side can actually defend and make a draw. But right now, next 2 lessons, rook and pawn versus rook. Let's take a look at the first example, the Philidor position. So Philidor position is something that everyone must know, and I just encourage you to actually look at this example and ask yourself, what would you play here as black? So the idea is, of course, to kind of stop this e5 pawn from promoting. And here we first can cut off the king from the 6th rank. So now king has to go back, or let's say play something like e6, and now rook goes all the way to g1, and we start checking from behind, and there is no progress that can be made. White cannot escape checks. It is a draw. Let's get to the next position, which would be the Lucena position, the bridge. The Lucena position, or so-called bridge, is also a very important technique. So first we give a check from f1. We need to promote our pawn to d8. So now if king goes to e6, we go king 8 and our pawn will be promoted. So black has to go to g7, and now this king is cut 2 files from this pawn. And now we can play rook f4, and the idea is simple. We wanna get rid of checks and eventually block the check from this rook on either e4 or d4. And what happens is rook c1, king s7, trying to promote the pawn, rook e1, king d6, rook e1, king s6, rook e1, king d5, and now we complete this maneuver, rook d4, white wins the game. Let's get to the next ending. Sometimes, if the defensive side cannot reach the Philidor position, it has to rely on the long side. In this case, we're just trying to check from the side. So it all starts with rook a check, king goes to d7, rook a7. And we're basically trying to give checks on a6 and on a8, king d8, rook a8, king d7, rook a7. And now if rook was, let's say, on b file, then it would result in a loss, because rook b7 check would not be possible, and e8 is a dangerous threat. So king d6, rook a6, king c5, and now rook goes to e6, takes the pawn. It is a draw. Let's get to the next example. The knight's pawn and the first, or let's say the 8th rank defense. So here we cannot really reach the Philidor position because rook is unfortunately on c1, and we can't go rook c6. If rook was, let's say, on g1, we'll go rook g6 and once again cut the king off. But now let's see what other defensive techniques exist. King a6, rook c8, and now pawn goes to b6. Potentially, of course, there is rook b7, rook a7, b7, rook e8, and white will win the game. So rook goes to f8, rook b7, and king a8. So king c8 would lose due to king a7, and this position is indeed lost. King a8, rook a7, king b8, rook h7, rook j8, and once again, no progress can be made. It is a draw. Let's get to ending number 56. There is also a very important defensive technique which you must know, called Kling and Horvitz defensive technique, which works with central and bishop pawns. So here rook slides all the way back to f1, king goes to d6, rook goes to e1. Now king goes to e6, threatening checkmate on h8, king goes to d8, rook h8, king c7, king f6. Now this pawn is about to be pushed. We go king d7, blocking this opportunity from them, rook h7, king e8, and now after king e6 we go king d8 once again, and there is no progress that can be made. Rook goes to h1 now, and after rook f8, trying to block f7, f6 check from h6 to rook e1. We are going back, and we insist on this defensive strategy. White cannot make any further progress. It is a draw. Let's get to the next position. Ending number 57, central 6th rank pawn, rook with distance effectiveness. So in the following case, the defending rook occupies the ideal square, ideal spot, because first, it's the farthest line from the king. It's the last file. Unfortunately, we can't go minus A, minus B. Otherwise, it would be even more ideal. And the 8th rank is now occupied, meaning that king cannot go there. So white tried to go rook d8. They're trying to reach king e8 and then maybe go e7. So rook a7 check, rook d7. Now rook a8. Once again, we occupy the last rank. Rook goes to d6. Now we go king g6. And it is the only move. We just wait near the pawn and see what white will do. They go rook d7. Now we return back with our king. They try rook c7. Once again, king g6. And now it is a draw. We just stand and wait. Other ways to draw is to play maybe something like rook a1 and rook d7, rook a2. There's also, let's say, king e8, king f6, e7, king e6. And once again, it is a draw. Because let's say rook goes this way, rook a8, rook d8, rook a7. And then we pick up a pawn on e7. And move like rook b8, let's say here, instead of rook a2, would result in a lost position, because after rook a7, this rook lacks effectiveness, and unfortunately it would be a loss. But let's take a look at the next example. So we reached the example where rook definitely lacks its effectiveness, and now it's on b file as opposed to a file where it would be a draw. So here white play king d6, king f6, king d7, now king goes to g7 back, king e7, now king is blocked, king g6, rook a1, and now we're trying to get the king to get the rook to g1 and cut the king off, so it would be 2 files away from the pawn. If king goes to f5, we can eventually go king f7 e7, so rook b7 check, king d8, rook b8, king c7, and now this effectiveness, distant effectiveness, doesn't work, as rook has to go somewhere, rook b2, now rook e1. We're about to promote this, king e8, and now e7, and finally we reach the Luciana position. It is a win for white. Let's take a look at the next example. Cutting off alone one file. Let's take a look at the following example. Our king on e6 is cut from this pawn by 1 file, so we're trying to hold this one with black. Here, king b4 was played, rook b8 check, king c5, rook c8 check, king b5, now king goes to a6. They try to push their pawn, but we go rook c8, and now they have to get back, or they have to go rook d4. King a5, attacking the rook, now rook d5 check, and now king goes to b5. Once again check, king a4, rook c8, king b4, rook b8, rook b5. So now white performed this idea rook d5, rook b5, just to block a check. Rook goes to h8. Our idea right now is to bring our king closer to this pawn. So rook goes to b7, king d6, king b5, rook h5 check. So c5 cannot be played, king b6, rook c5. And we're trying to take the pawn on c4. Rook d7, king d7, king c5, king c7. Black take their position and draw this game. Let's take a look at the next very exciting ending position. Let's go. In the last example, we saw that king was cut off by 1 file between pawn, open file, and then king. In the following case, d file and d file are both cut from this king on f6, and white are performing a winning maneuver. King b4, rook b8. It looks the same, all the same, but it's very important where king located. It's too far. Rook b8, rook c8, and now rook c1. And yes, it looks like the king is actually getting close, but still it is not enough. King b6, rook h5, c5, king d8, rook d1, king c8, rook g1, trying to checkmate. Rook h8, c6, rook f8, rook a1, and now the point is we're threatening rook a8. The rook obviously cannot move. King goes to b8, and now c7, king c8, rook a8. White wins the game. Hope you enjoyed this lesson. We'll continue with this rook endgames in the next lesson next week. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.